In the middle of a live congressional hearing, a white former attorney general looked Jasmine Crockett straight in the eye and told her to go back to Africa. What Jasmine did next wasn't loud, but it was deadly. She didn't argue. She opened a Justice Department file that exposed years of racial discrimination under Bondi's leadership, harsher sentencing for black defendants, political pressure to crack down on minority groups to gain voter approval. So the question is, what happens when the truth walks into power and refuses to back down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. Wednesday morning. The air outside was dry and sharp like a blade. Inside the Capitol hearing room 4A was packed wall to wall, every seat reserved for the public had been filled since sunrise. Cameras lined the back of the room, network crews, press reporters, independent streamers, all pointed at two microphones in the center of the hearing floor. This wasn't just any congressional session, it was a hearing on racial bias in America's criminal justice system. People hadn't come to listen, they came to witness, to find out if justice in this country truly wore a blindfold or just turned its face away. From certain skin tones on the left side of the table sat Jasmine Crockett, a black congresswoman from Texas, former criminal defense attorney with over 100 courtroom victories. She wore a navy blue suit, sat upright like a steel rod, and held the gaze of the room like a conductor leading a symphony. Jasmine didn't come to perform, she came to prosecute. She was the embodiment of a new wave in America. Young, brilliant, and unafraid to confront the arid in the system, not just with passion but with proof. Across from her sat Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, blonde, composed, exuding the chill of courtroom confidence. Her career had been built on tough on crime policies, praised by conservatives, criticized by civil rights groups for racial disparities and prosecutions. Today she wasn't behind a podium of power, she was answering, or at least expected to. But this wasn't just a meeting between two public officials, it was a collision between two American realities. On one side, reform, accountability, the demand for equity; on the other, tradition, order, and the fear that change could unravel a nation too proud to admit its flaws. Two women, two skin tones, two visions of America, and one burning question hanging in the air: does justice in America see color? The room had settled. The cameras were locked in place, red lights blinking steadily like waiting eyes. Pages stopped rustling, phones were on silent, reporters held pens just above their notepads, waiting not just to transcribe but to capture a moment. This was that kind of morning, the kind history books footnote, the kind you never forget. A senior clerk stood and called the hearing to order. The Committee on Justice and Civil Rights is now in session. Chairs shifted, suits straightened. The chairman, a gray-haired man from Oregon with a voice like sandpaper, offered brief remarks, then nodded toward Jasmine Crockett. She cleared her throat once, not out of nervousness but focus. Her eyes didn't search the room, they locked onto it. Unyielding. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Today I stand not as an adversary but as a witness to a pattern we've all seen and too few have named. I hope we can examine not just statutes she never got to finish. Pam Bondi leaned forward, voice smooth, surgical, and unmistakably loaded with contempt. Maybe, she said, instead of trying to teach America how to do justice, you should go back to Africa and study your own roots first. The silence was instant and chilling, not shocked silence, strategic, calculated, terrifying. A heartbeat passed, then another. A young black aide turned his head. A woman in the gallery gasped, hand frozen halfway to her coffee cup. Someone whispered a curse under their breath, and then nothing, just the weight of those words hovering in the space between microphones and marble columns, suffocating any pretense of decorum. Jasmine did not flinch. She didn't recoil. She didn't raise her voice. She remained perfectly still, the kind of stillness that signals not confusion but control. Her hands rested gently on the table, her posture composed, untouched by the chaos beginning to stir around her. Only her eyes moved. They lifted slowly and settled on Pam Bondi, calm and precise. There was no fire in them but something far more exact, focus. The expression on her face did not accuse, it examined. Across the chamber, staffers shifted in their seats. A reporter paused mid-sentence, pen hovering above paper. The weight in the room had turned, no longer centered on the insult but on the response that was about to follow. Then came Jasmine's voice, measured, cool, and devastating in its simplicity. I'm sorry, She said softly, "What did you just say?" It wasn't a request, it was a reckoning. The question didn't fill the space, it emptied it, forcing everyone to confront the ugliness now hanging in the air, no longer deniable, no echo, no murmuring, only the tense awareness of a room that had shifted from legal procedure to moral theater. Jasmine remained motionless, but her presence had expanded. There was nothing defensive in her tone, only precision, clarity, and beneath it the suggestion that something much larger than a reply was coming. Pam Bondi rose from her chair with a slow, almost ceremonial calm, the kind of calm that doesn't soften a blow but sharpens it. She didn't fumble, she didn't raise her voice, her movements were controlled, rehearsed, like someone who had already decided she wasn't going to back down. Her eyes moved across the room, past the cameras, past the aides and representatives, and locked onto Jasmine. Her hands smoothed the hem of her blazer, a subtle gesture that looked like composure but felt like tightening armor. Then she leaned slightly forward, adjusted the mic, and spoke with the clarity of someone who wanted her words to carry not just through the chamber, but through every living room in America. "I said, if you think this country is so unjust, so broken, then maybe you should go back to Africa and fix that instead." The sentence didn't echo, not because it wasn't loud, but because it hit too fast, too hard, too directly. For a moment it felt like the air itself paused, not silence from quiet, silence from tension, like everyone had been forced to hold their breath at the same time. A senator near the back shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. A congressional aide dropped her pen and didn't bother picking it up. The camera crew didn't move, but one of them instinctively zoomed in tighter, like trying to frame the shame more clearly. Across the country, millions of TVs were now replaying the sentence, raw, uncensored, on every news channel, captions already scrolling the words. Didn't just insult, they revealed, they cracked something open that had always been there beneath the suits, behind the language of policy and civility. And in this moment it wasn't about debate, it wasn't even about politics, it was about what had just been said, and the fact that it had been said into a live microphone on government record. No one could pretend they hadn't heard it. Pam had thrown her words like a weapon, but the moment they hit the air they no longer belonged to her. The silence that followed belonged to Jasmine, and everyone knew it. Jasmine didn't flinch, she didn't throw her hands up, she didn't demand silence, she didn't shout. What she did instead was worse for those hoping she'd crumble. She stayed still for a long moment, breathing calm, eyes lowered just slightly, like sorting through not just what to say but how to say it. Then she stood, the legs of her chair scraped quietly but loud enough in the silence to turn heads. She didn't rush, didn't perform, she just pushed her chair back and stepped away from the table. Her heels clicked gently on the marble. She walked forward, not toward Pam, but toward the center of the room. The space between the rows felt like a stage, but she wasn't performing, she was claiming ground. And by the time she reached the middle, every pair of eyes, from aides to senators to cameramen, were locked on her. She stood tall, hands at her sides, face steady. She didn't need to raise her voice, the room was already hers. When she began to speak, her voice was soft, but it traveled clear, full, without a tremor. "I was born in Texas," she said, pausing briefly before the next line. "My father served in the United States military. He wore the uniform, followed orders, risked his life for this country. My mother was a nurse, a caregiver who never asked what her patients believed or what color they were. She just helped. That's what we were raised to do, to serve, to work hard, to believe in a place that has not always believed in us." She took a breath and the room shifted. Some dropped their gaze, others watched closer, now leaning in. "But my story doesn't start with them," she continued. "It starts with the people who never got to tell theirs. My ancestors didn't book a flight here, they didn't come chasing the American dream. They were chained, shackled, torn from their homes, dragged across the Atlantic like cargo, packed into ships so tight they couldn't even stand. They were sold, branded, forced into labor on stolen land, and for generations they were told they didn't count, not as citizens, not even as humans. But they survived, they endured." There was no anger in her voice, just truth, heavy, grounded, real. "And somehow," she said, "after everything they still believed in something better. They fought, they built, they gave birth to people like me, people who still believe in this country even when it forgets us." She turned her gaze now directly openly toward Pam Bondi. Her tone didn't change, but her eyes did. They sharpen, not with hate, not with rage, but with clarity, cold clear clarity. You want me to go back to Africa? Her voice steady as stone. Let me tell you something. I was here before you were born. My family's blood was in this soil before your family ever signed a mortgage. We were here before your laws let us vote, before your schools let us learn, before your sidewalks had our names carved into history. Her voice didn't rise, but its weight grew heavier. With every word you look at me and see someone who doesn't belong, but I'm not the guest here, I'm the foundation. You don't get to ask me to leave a house that was built on the backs of my ancestors. You don't get to erase the pain, the work, the dignity that came long before you could even stand in this room. There were no gasps now, only silence, dense, loaded listening. Jasmine's voice dropped even lower. You say I should leave, that I should go back. My people died here, they gave birth here, they were buried without names, without gravestones, without justice, but they stayed, and I'm still here. She paused, not for applause, not for effect, but because the weight needed room to settle. She looked around the room, not seeking approval, just making sure there was no escape from what had just been said. So no, she said softly but unshakably, I'm not going back. I'm not leaving. I belong here, and I'm not the one who needs to be reminded of that. Jasmine had just claimed her history, but now she turned to the thing power fears most. Proof. Jasmine didn't turn up the volume, she didn't change her tone, but something shifted. Her stance steadied, her shoulders squared, her hands still, her voice now a touch firmer, like someone moving from memory into evidence. She returned to her seat only long. Then she leaned slightly forward, adjusted the mic, and spoke with the clarity of someone who wanted her words to carry not just through the chamber, but through every living room in America. I said, if you think this country is so unjust, so broken, then maybe you should go back to Africa and fix that instead. The sentence didn't echo, not because it wasn't loud, but because it hit too fast, too hard, too directly. For a moment it felt like the air itself paused, not silence from quiet, silence from tension, like everyone had been forced to hold their breath at the same time. A senator near the back shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. A congressional aide dropped her pen and didn't bother picking it up. The camera crew didn't move, but one of them instinctively zoomed in tighter, like trying to frame the shame more clearly. Across the country, millions of TVs were now replaying the sentence, raw, uncensored, on every news channel. Captions already scrolling the words didn't just insult, they revealed, they cracked something open that had always been there beneath the suits, behind the language of policy and civility. And in this moment it wasn't about debate, it wasn't even about politics, it was about what had just been said, and the fact that it had been said into a live microphone on government record. No one could pretend they hadn't heard it. Pam had thrown her words like a weapon, but the moment they hit the air they no longer belonged to her. The silence that followed belonged to Jasmine, and everyone knew it. Jasmine didn't flinch, she didn't throw her hands up, she didn't demand silence, she didn't shout. What she did instead was worse for those hoping she'd crumble. She stayed still for a long moment, breathing calm, eyes lowered just slightly, like sorting through not just what to say but how to say it. Then she stood, the legs of her chair scraped quietly but loud enough in the silence to turn heads. She didn't rush, didn't perform, she just pushed her chair back and stepped away from the table. Her heels clicked gently on the marble. She walked forward, not toward Pam, but toward the center of the room. The space between the rows felt like a stage, but she wasn't performing, she was claiming ground. And by the time she reached the middle, every pair of eyes, from aides to senators to cameramen, were locked on her. She stood tall, hands at her sides, face steady. She didn't need to raise her voice, the room was already hers. When she began to speak, her voice was soft, but it traveled clear, full, without a tremor. I was born in Texas, she said, pausing briefly before the next line. My father served in the United States military, he wore the uniform, followed orders, risked his life for this country. My mother was a nurse, a caregiver who never asked what her patients believed or what color they were, she just helped. That's what we were raised to do, to serve, to work hard, to believe in a place that has not always believed in us. She took a breath and the room shifted. Some dropped their gaze. Others watch closer now, leaning in. But my story doesn't start with them, she continued. It starts with the people who never got to tell theirs. My ancestors didn't book a flight here, they didn't come chasing the American dream. They were chained, shackled, torn from their homes, dragged across the Atlantic like cargo, packed into ships so tight they couldn't even stand. They were sold, branded, forced into labor on stolen land, and for generations they were told they didn't count, not as citizens, not even as humans, but they survived, they endured. There was no anger in her voice, just truth, heavy, grounded, real, and somehow, she said, after everything they still believed in something better. They fought, they built, they gave birth to people like me, people who still believe in this country even when it forgets us. She turned her gaze now directly, openly toward Pam Bondi. Her tone didn't change, but her eyes did. They sharpen, not with hate, not with rage, but with clarity, cold, clear clarity. You want me to go back to Africa? Her voice steady as stone. Let me tell you something. I was here before you were born. My family's blood was in this soil before your family ever signed a mortgage. We were here before your laws let us vote, before your schools let us learn, before your sidewalks had our names carved into history. Her voice didn't rise, but its weight grew heavier. With every word you look at me and see someone who doesn't belong, but I'm not the guest here, I'm the foundation. You don't get to ask me to leave a house that was built on the backs of my ancestors. You don't get to erase the pain, the work, the dignity that came long before you could even stand in this room. There were no gasps now, only silence, dense, loaded, listening. Jasmine's voice dropped even lower. You say I should leave, that I should go back. My people died here, they gave birth here, they were buried without names, without gravestones, without justice, but they stayed, and I'm still here. She paused, not for applause, not for effect, but because the weight needed room to settle. She looked around the room, not seeking approval, just making sure there was no escape from what had just been said. So no, she said softly but unshakably, I'm not going back, I'm not leaving, I belong here, and I'm not the one who needs to be reminded of that. Jasmine had just claimed her history, but now she turned to the thing power fears most. Proof. Jasmine didn't turn up the volume, she didn't change her tone, but something shifted. Her stance steadied, her shoulders squared, her hands still, her voice now a touch firmer, like someone moving from memory into evidence. She returned to her seat, only long the file as she raised her head, her gaze fixed on the woman who had moments ago told her to go back to where she came from. Jasmine didn't blink, she didn't smile, she simply spoke, voice steady, eyes locked as if addressing a courtroom that had been in denial for far too long. You told me I should go back to Africa, her tone stripped of all emotion except truth. Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run. Her words didn't come like bullets, they came like bricks stacked into a wall of reality no one could climb over. Justice doesn't come from slogans or speeches or spin, it doesn't come from being loud or from talking first, it comes from courage and from facing the truth even when it's ugly, even when it's yours. There was still no response from Bondi, none expected. Her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale, her expression somewhere between disbelief and collapse. She didn't reach for the mic, she didn't interrupt, because at that moment there was nothing left to say that could undo what had been said. And worse, what had been proven. Jasmine took one step back, not for effect, not for the cameras, just to let the air move again, but her presence didn't shrink. If anything, it expanded, because now the silence belonged to her. It was no longer the awkward hush that follows insult, it was the heavy quiet that comes when someone delivers truth so clearly, so plainly, that there is no room left to argue. You talk about law and order, she said, her voice lowering, now quieter, but still razor sharp, but all I see here is selective justice, manufactured fear, and a system built not to protect everyone but to preserve power for the few. She paused, scanning the room now. Eyes were meeting hers, not all of them, not loudly, but enough to see that the ground had shifted even here in this building where denial wears suits and calls itself policy. The silence had turned across the aisle. A Democratic senator nodded once. Slowly opposite him, a Republican committee member, older, gray, rarely known to break party lines, gave a small, almost imperceptible tilt of the head. No applause, no grand gestures, just Acknowledgement, the kind that comes when even political armor can't defend the indefensible. Jasmine let out a slow breath, not in relief but in control. Everything she had brought, the testimony, the memory, the document, the truth had now been spoken aloud in full in front of the nation. She didn't need to win anyone over, she just needed them to hear it, to know, and they did. The hearing ended, but the moment didn't, because some truths once spoken don't stay in the room, they move, they spread, and they don't ask for permission. By the time Jasmine stepped away from the podium and returned to her seat, the video was already being clipped. A congressional aide with a phone held low had caught it, so had a reporter in the back live streaming the hearing to 20,000 silent viewers, and then it was out. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a full minute. Edited versions hit TikTok first, then Twitter, then YouTube. Some added no captions, no edits, no filters, just raw footage. Jasmine Crockett standing in the middle of the United States Capitol, folder in hand, looking a former Attorney General dead in the eye and saying, "You want me to go back to Africa? Read the country you ran." It spread like fire. Not because it was loud, but because it was real in a way that broke through politics, through partisanship, through the numbness of another news cycle. It wasn't a debate, it wasn't a scandal, it was a moment, and it hit different. The clip was viewed 3 million times in the first 6 hours, 10 million by the end of the day. It was trending on X, stitched across thousands of TikToks, played on a loop on political podcasts, late-night talk shows, and Instagram reels. But it wasn't just the volume that made it matter, it was who was sharing it. And why? A retired U.S. Marine posted the video with one line: "This wasn't an argument, this was a bullet through every lie I was taught to believe about justice." A university professor tweeted a transcript with the caption, "Teaching this in class tomorrow, no notes, this is what courage looks like." And then there was the father, a white man in his early 40s, sitting in a small living room somewhere in Pennsylvania, posted a video of himself watching Jasmine's speech with his son. The boy was maybe 12, eyes wide, hands still. The father didn't say anything while the clip played, but when it ended, the boy looked at him and said, "She sounds like Grandpa when he talks about the war." The man choked up, turned to the camera and said, "I watched this with my son, and I'm proud that he cried." The comment section blew up. Thousands responded: veterans, teachers, nurses, construction workers, stay-at-home moms, teenagers, retirees, black, white, brown, people who'd never agreed on anything before, suddenly sharing something more powerful than politics. The shock of hearing someone finally tell the truth without flinching. Some said it reminded them of their own silences, their own fears, the times they'd wanted to speak up and hadn't. One comment read, "I didn't realize how much I needed to hear someone say it like that, calm, director, unapologetic." Another said, "This wasn't about race alone, this was about dignity. And it reminded me how far we still have to go." In barbershops in Atlanta it was playing on TV, in classrooms in Detroit it was discussed by students who'd never watched a congressional hearing in their lives. In diners in Oklahoma and gas stations in Ohio, people watched it over coffee, some nodding quietly, some shaking their heads, but watching, really watching. And on cable news the debate was no longer about whether the system was biased, it was about whether this hearing had just changed the conversation for good. Analysts scrambled for statements. Pam Bondi declined to appear. Her office released one line, "No comment at this time." It didn't help. The silence only confirmed what Jasmine's voice had already made plain. Even lawmakers, usually cautious, couldn't avoid the wave. Some tweeted support outright, others stayed quiet, but their silence stood in stark contrast to the sound of the nation speaking for itself. The hearing was no longer just on record, it was on replay, in phones, in inboxes, in minds. It wasn't going away. In interviews, Jasmine said little. She didn't do a media tour. She didn't sell the moment. When asked what she felt when the clip went viral, she said, "I didn't say it for cameras, I said it because someone had to. And that's why it hit harder than most headlines ever could, because it wasn't designed for sound bites. It was a truth bomb dropped in a room built to contain polite lies, and it exploded. The cameras had stopped rolling, the country had moved on, or so it seemed, but not everyone left the room untouched, and some truths don't erupt, they erode one quiet hour at a time. Pam Bondi sat alone. Not just physically, though that too was true. Her staff had scattered, the aides who usually hovered with notebooks and water bottles when nowhere in sight. No reporters chased her for quotes, no senators offered a handshake, not even a single real talk later. Just silence. Thick, dense and unfamiliar, she sat at the edge of a cold marble bench in a back quarter of the Capitol, far from the bright lights and bold voices. The hearing room was empty now, its chairs pushed back in uneven rows, the air still holding the electricity of what had happened just an hour earlier. Pam had slipped out the side door quietly, not because she was ashamed, not yet, but because she didn't know what to do next, and that for someone like her was unfamiliar, frightening even. She stared at the floor, the tile pattern, crisp black diamonds against white, seemed suddenly more complicated than she remembered. Every breath she took felt just slightly heavier than it should have. She adjusted her jacket, smoothed the crease of her skirt, little gestures to fill the quiet, but it didn't help. Nothing helped, not when the words were still echoing in her head. Jasmine's voice, calm and unflinching. Maybe you should go back and read the documents from the country you helped run. Pam had been in tough rooms before. She'd argued with judges, sparred with journalists, weathered scandals and smear campaigns, but this was different. This wasn't a headline, this wasn't a fight she could spin in post. This had landed not just out there, inside, and suddenly, without warning, her mind drifted not to the moment on camera, but to something much further back, something she hadn't thought about in years. She was 22, law school broke, proud and stupid. She'd parked in the wrong lot after hours. University property, no sticker, and inside the car a bottle of wine, half finished dish, forgotten from a night before. Campus security found it, called the police. Technically it could have been charged minor in possession, vehicle violation, intent to transport alcohol illegally. She could have lost her clerkship, her internship, her shot, but she didn't, because of Marcus Daniels, one of the only black students in her year. Soft-spoken, brilliant, kind. They weren't close, just classmates. She barely remembered what they talked about in class, but he'd seen her pacing outside the building, hands shaking, voice high with panic. He'd asked what happened. She'd told him, embarrassed, angry, and without hesitating he'd said, "Come with me." He knew one of the campus officers. A cousin talked to him, vouched for her, calmed it down, quieted the whole thing. No report filed, no disciplinary hearing. It disappeared, and Pam, she barely said thank you. She never asked Marcus why he helped her, never brought it up again, and within a year she'd forgotten it or buried it in the flood of ambition, strategy, forward motion. But now it came back in full color. She could see his face, hear his voice, feel the weight of how fast she had moved past it, and sitting there alone, she realized she had never returned the favor, never checked in, never even admitted to herself that someone else's grace had once saved her career before it started. She swallowed hard. The hallway lights were cold and flat, humming softly. Her fingers curled in her lap, had gone stiff. What if this time I'm not right? The question wasn't loud, not even fully formed, but it was there, sitting at the edge of her chest, like a bruise she'd never noticed until now. She'd built her career on strength, on being unshakable, but for the first time in her life the armor didn't fit. It felt hollow, like she was holding a shield but had forgotten what she was defending. Jasmine hadn't yelled, that's what haunted her. She hadn't yelled, hadn't attacked, she just told the truth. And the worst part, it hadn't been cruel, it had been measured, precise and devastating, because Pam hadn't just been challenged, she'd been seen, truly seen. Stripped of the title, the years, the rhetoric, she had been reduced to the hardest kind of reflection, herself, and no one came to help her up. Not a single hand reached out, not a single word of comfort, because somewhere deep down everyone in that room had known the truth before Jasmine ever said it. They just hadn't expected someone to say it so clearly. Pam blinked, her eyes burned, but no tears came. She wasn't crying, not really. She wasn't built for that, but she wasn't steady either, and that alone felt like defeat. She reached for her phone, then put it back. There was no message she could send, no tweet that would fix it, no statement that would make the internet forget what they had seen, because they hadn't just watched her get embarrassed, they had watched her lose her footing, and worse, they'd watched her learn, maybe for the first time. Inside the walls had witnessed something rare, truth spoken without apology, but outside the world was still spinning, and Jasmine knew some rooms you walk into with facts, others with fire. The sound hit her first, muffled but growing, the deep hum of Human voices swelling outside the hallway like a rising tide. The press had been waiting. They always waited, but this time they weren't just covering a story, they were chasing something no one had expected to unfold live. A reckoning broadcast in real time. Jasmine stood behind the heavy oak doors of the hearing room, her hands still resting on the leather folder she had carried to the podium. It felt lighter now, as if some weight had transferred from her chest into the air. She breathed once deeply, not to calm herself. She didn't need calming, she needed focus. Behind her the chamber was emptying. Members of the committee filtered out through side exits, some deliberately avoiding eye contact, others glancing at her before looking quickly away. No one stopped her, no one asked for a comment they didn't have to. The room had already spoken, and not a single voice had challenged her. In those final moments, a young staffer opened the double doors. The sound hit full force now, reporters shouting over each other, cameras flashing in bursts, a crush of bodies held back by velvet ropes and security lines, all pointed in one direction. Hers. Jasmine straightened her blazer, no mirror check, no fixing her hair. She adjusted the folder in her hand, stepped forward and walked through the doors into the chaos. The flash bulbs lit her up instantly, a wall of light like the surface of a wave crashing against stone. Voices bombarded her. Congresswoman Crockett, do you plan to file ethics charges? How do you respond to those calling your comments divisive? Do you believe Pam Bondi should resign from her current advisory role? She didn't answer immediately. She walked slow, deliberate steps down the long marbled hallway, the click of her heels swallowed by the barrage of questions and shutter clicks. Security guards flanked her, but not tightly. They didn't guide her, they just moved in rhythm, like they knew she didn't need protection from the crowd, only space. She reached the press line, a half moon of microphones, reporters and live stream phones. She stopped, and the room, if it could be called that, changed, because Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she didn't raise a hand to quiet them. She simply looked forward, locked eyes with the first camera she saw, and waited until the crowd stilled, until it realized that silence, not noise, would get them answers. Let me be clear, she began, her voice even, firm, caring, without shouting. What happened today was not planned. I didn't come into that room looking for a fight. The reporters leaned forward, notebooks ready, thumbs on phones, waiting, but I came prepared to speak the truth, and when I was told in front of my colleagues and the American people that I should go back to Africa, I had a choice. She paused, not for drama, for control. I could have responded with anger, I could have walked out, or I could do what every black woman in this country has had to do for generations: stay in the room, stay calm, and speak anyway. The flash bulbs went off again. Slower now, less frantic, more focused. What you saw wasn't an attack, it wasn't even a defense, it was a mirror, and what it reflected some people weren't ready to see. She held up the folder again, now closed, but still present. This document isn't about me, it's about years of data, of patterns of pain that's been papered over by bureaucracy. That pain deserves more than silence, it deserves action. The reporters were no longer shouting, they were writing, recording, watching her, not for missteps but for meaning. So no, I don't regret what I said, I don't regret reading those numbers, and I don't regret looking someone in the eye and telling them the truth about the country they helped shape. She scanned the line now, reporter to reporter, lens to lens. This isn't about parties, it's not about left or right, it's about right or wrong. And today we all saw the difference. For a moment no one moved, no follow-up question, no scramble, just that rarest thing in American politics, a pause, a breath, then the questions returned, but slower, more focused, more cautious. Congresswoman, are you calling for a federal investigation into the DOJ's findings? Do you plan to introduce a bill addressing sentencing disparities? She raised a hand, not to silence but to signal one final thought. I'm not here to lead a crusade, I'm here to remind this country what justice looks like when it's not filtered through comfort. If that makes people uncomfortable, they should ask why, not point fingers. Then she turned, thanked the press quietly, and continued walking through the lights, through the noise, through the history being written under her feet. Behind her, reporters filed stories, clips uploaded in real time, hashtags exploded, but Jasmine didn't look back. She didn't need to. The work wasn't behind her, it was ahead, and now the country was finally watching. Not all collapse happens in public, some reckoning arrives quietly through a blinking cursor, an open laptop, and a silence no camera can catch. The House was too quiet, no aides, no press calls, no camera crews on standby, just stillness, the heavy airless kind that comes after a long day of noise. Pam Bondi sat alone at the kitchen table of her beachfront home, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she hadn't touched in over an hour. The mug had gone cold, just like the energy that once wrapped itself around her name, her title, her presence. Her phone lay face down on the marble counter beside her, still vibrating every few minutes with notifications. She no longer had the stomach to read mentions, headlines, hashtags. She didn't need to open them, she already knew the clip was everywhere. Jasmine Crockett's calm voice, her own frozen face, the silence that had swallowed the room when Jasmine read the DOJ memo out loud, word for word. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was exposure, and for the first time in years, no one was coming to fix it for her. The laptop sat open in front of her, a blank screen, a blinking cursor. She hadn't planned to write anything. Her instinct, the one that had carried her through 2 decades of public life, was to control the narrative, deflect, deny, say it was out of context, say the moment had been misunderstood, say she was defending herself, not attacking anyone. The classic playbook, but this time her hands had refused to move. Her gut wouldn't cooperate, because this time she knew she rested, her elbows on the table, head heavy. Outside, the Florida sky was melting from orange to dark, but inside, she felt like she'd just walked off a cliff. Then, without fully knowing why, she began to type Congresswoman Crockett. The word sat on the screen stiff and too formal. She deleted the dash, backspaced, rewrote, I don't expect forgiveness, I'm not sure I deserve it, but I want to say what I should have said in that room, what I should have remembered long before this week. Her fingers hesitated, then moved again. The words didn't come in a rush, they came like bricks, heavy, careful, one at a time. We don't always notice the water we are swimming in until someone drains the pool, and this week you drained it for me. She paused, the silence deepened. Across the table sat a folder, the same one her legal assistant had brought her earlier, printouts from the DOJ's internal investigation, the very one Jasmine had read aloud. Pam had skimmed it that morning after the hearing. She read it again, cover to cover, page by page, no interruptions, no staff commentary, and she couldn't deny it anymore. The numbers were real, the language was real, the pattern was real, and so was the weight she'd always pretended not to carry. She reached for the keyboard again. I wasn't ready to face it, because it's easier to pretend you're the hero in your story even when the evidence says otherwise. Then came the memory, uninvited, vivid, law school, age 22, a parking ticket that could have become something bigger, a forgotten wine bottle in the back seat, a security guard ready to escalate, and Marcus Daniels. Marcus had been a year ahead of her, quiet, brilliant, black. He saw her pacing outside the law building, about to cry. She'd never asked for help, but he offered it anyway, spoke to the officer, used calm, respectful language that somehow de-escalated everything, and just like that the whole thing disappeared. No report, no hearing, no record, her future preserved. She'd never thanked him, not really, maybe a half smile, a rushed thanks before leaving, and she never brought it up again. She hadn't thought of Marcus in years, until tonight. She swallowed. There was a time when someone who looked like you stepped in and changed the entire direction of my life, and I forgot I'd buried it. I never repaid it. Her fingers stilled. You didn't humiliate me in that hearing, you didn't try to make me smaller. You held up a mirror, and for the first time I saw the version of myself I've spent too long avoiding. She exhaled. I saw the woman who dismissed reports without reading them. I saw the leader who spoke without listening. I saw the person who in one sentence told another American she didn't belong here, when all she had done was tell the truth. Pam leaned back in the chair, eyes stinging but dry. She wasn't crying, not exactly, but something behind her ribs felt like it had cracked open. She looked at the screen again. The words weren't clever, they weren't built for headlines, they weren't political strategy, they were human. She continued, this isn't a statement, this isn't something I wrote for the cameras. My team doesn't know I'm writing this. Maybe I'll never send it, maybe I'm not supposed to, but if you ever read this, just know you were right, not just in what you said, but in how you said it. She sat there, hands still. Then, without thinking, she moved the cursor to the top of the screen, clicked save, draft closed the laptop. She didn't send it, not tonight. She wasn't ready to be forgiven, but she was ready to feel the weight of what she'd been a part of and what she could no longer ignore. And for the first Time in years Pam Bondi sat in silence without trying to escape it. Not every change starts in Washington. Some begin in quiet places far from marble halls and microphones, like a classroom where the future learns how to see the present differently. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above. It was the third period at Oak Ridge Middle School, and the air felt heavy, like a storm had passed through but hadn't yet finished. Miss Lena Hayward stood near the front of the classroom, a remote in one hand, the other resting gently on a stack of ungraded quizzes. The smartboard screen glowed behind her with a paused YouTube clip, a freeze frame of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett standing at a podium, calm eyes forward mid-sentence. The kids were unusually still. No whispers, no tapping feet, no paper wads flying across the room. They were watching. Earlier that morning, Miss Hayward had seen the clip on her phone while sipping her coffee. She hadn't planned to show it. It wasn't in the day's lesson on Reconstruction or the Civil Rights Movement, but something about Jasmine's voice, the way she stood there, unwavering, surrounded by power and refusing to shrink, stayed with her. So she pulled it up during her planning period, watched it again, then once more. By lunchtime she had made her decision. She cued the clip just before the final exchange, where Jasmine turned the hearing into something bigger than herself, something permanent, something historical. Now 23 pairs of young eyes stared at the screen, waiting for the sound to resume. Ms. Hayward clicked play. Jasmine's voice returned, steady and unhurried. Justice doesn't come from speeches, it comes from courage and from facing the truth even when it's yours. The clip ended. Silence, a real one, not the we are waiting for class to end kind, not the we are tired kind, a silence of processing, of hearing, and at the center of it all Jasmine stood, frozen in digital stillness, folder in hand, unbending. No one moved. Finally a hand went up. It was Marcus, quiet, always in the third row, always watching. More than he spoke. Is she in trouble for saying that? He asked. Miss Hayward looked at him carefully. No, she said, not officially, but when people speak the truth like that, some folks make it hard for them. Another hand. Sophia was the other lady, like in charge of her in that hearing. No, Miss Hayward said, but she used to be the Attorney General of an entire state. That drew a few looks. A couple kids murmured, surprised they were used to adults being challenged on TikTok, not in Congress. A boy in the back Deshaun leaned forward. She said to go back to Africa out loud. Ms. Hayward nodded slowly. Yes, on the record, on camera. Deshaun shook his head. My grandma used to say, if they don't hit you, they'll try to humiliate you. The class didn't laugh. It wasn't that kind of line. Then from the second row Amaya raised her hand halfway, not fully, just enough to be seen. She didn't yell, she said. Miss Hayward looked at her number. She didn't. Amaya nodded again. She could have, but she didn't. That's harder. The room went still again. There was power in that observation, more than some of the adults on TV could have mustered, because Jasmine hadn't won the room by force. She'd held it. She had used restraint the way others used fire, not to burn but to expose. Ms. Hayward let the silence stretch a little longer. Then she walked slowly to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. On it she wrote in bold letters, courage is not the volume of your voice, it's the weight of your truth. She turned back to the class. I want you all to think about what we saw, she said, not just what was said but how it was said. The facts she brought, the way she stood her ground, and the way the room changed, not because she shouted but because she refused to back down. She saw heads nodding. Even Jamal, who normally kept his hoodie up and his interest low, was sitting straight. I'm not asking you to pick sides, she continued, but I am asking you to remember this moment, because you're going to see a lot of voices like hers, and you're going to see a lot of people try to silence them, and when that happens you need to ask yourself, what would I do if I were in that room? The question hung in the air. A few students scribbled notes, others stared at the screen, still seeing Jasmine there. Then at the very back a girl named Rachel raised her hand. My dad saw it, she said. He came home from work and he showed it to me, said it reminded him of something his mom used to tell him, that truth is heavy and most people are too scared to carry it. M. Hayward smiled softly. He's right. The bell rang, but no one jumped, no one rushed the door. A few kids packed up slowly, a few stayed to ask more questions, and as they filtered out Ms. Hayward looked at the pause frame one last time. Jasmine's still image, eyes forward, unsiling, undeniable. She thought of how many textbooks had skipped people like her. She thought of How many young minds had waited too long to hear someone like Jasmine speak, and then in that quiet classroom in Mississippi she closed the video, but she knew the conversation had only just begun. The story had played out in courtrooms and classrooms, on screens and sidewalks, but the real question wasn't about what was said, it was about what we took from it and what we do now. In the days that followed, the world didn't stop, but it slowed like a held breath that wasn't ready to be released. The news cycle spun as it always does. New scandals, new bills, new polls, but somehow Jasmine Crockett's voice kept cutting through the noise, not because she shouted, not because she made herself the center, but because her truth didn't need anything louder than clarity. And in that clarity something had shifted, not just for the people in that hearing but for everyone watching. It was as if the country, so used to deflection and denial, had stumbled into a mirror and finally stopped pretending it didn't recognize its own reflection. The story could have ended there, with the applause, with the silence, with Pam's shattered expression and Jasmine's calm command of the room. But real stories don't end with claps or camera fades. Real stories end or begin when we ask ourselves what we are meant to carry from them, because this wasn't just about one insult in one hearing. It wasn't just about two women or two ideologies. It was about what happens when we finally listen, not just to the data or the drama, but to the truth that's been waiting generations to be heard. The human lesson wasn't subtle. It never is. Injustice doesn't arrive with fireworks, it arrives in small decisions. Sentencing memos buried in files, a shrug at the word bias, a smile at the wrong joke, a silence when someone's dignity is stepped on. And that's what made Jasmine's response so radical. Not that she spoke truth, but that she spoke it in a room designed to ignore it, that she carried the weight of history, hers, her ancestors, her communities, and placed it piece by piece on a table that had too long gone undisturbed. And what did she ask for in return? Not applause, not pity, just recognition. Recognition that justice without reflection is theater, that patriotism without accountability is vanity, that equality without memory is fiction, and that if America wants to be honest about its future, it has to start by being honest about its past, not in private conversations but in public, uncomfortable places. Places like the floor of Congress, places like that classroom in Mississippi, places like the living room of a white father who watched his son cry, not because he was sad but because he was awake, because that's what Jasmine did. She woke people up, not with noise but with stillness, not with rage but with precision, and in doing so she reminded us of something we keep forgetting, that truth is not fragile but comfort is. She reminded us that people like her, people who've spent their whole lives being told they don't belong, that they should be quieter, smaller, less angry, have held this country up with more dignity than most of its institutions, that the descendants of the enslaved have done more to protect the dream of America than many of its most powerful, that the ones most denied by the system often carry the deepest faith in its promise and the greatest courage to hold it accountable. That's the tragedy, and that's the hope, because what Jasmine exposed wasn't just the gap between word and action, it was the cost of that gap, measured not in headlines but in lives, in freedom denied, in time stolen, in families fractured by sentencing guidelines, by courtroom bias, by the cold quiet racism of a neutral system. And yet she stood there anyway. She didn't run, she didn't fold, she didn't ask to be protected, she asked to be heard. And in that hearing something sacred happened. For a moment the nation stopped explaining itself, it listened. And that is the beginning of everything, because systems don't change through shame, they change through reckoning. Through the painful public act of admitting what has always been true and daring to become something better. Jasmine's power wasn't in her anger, it was in her grace, grace rooted in pain. Grace that didn't excuse, that didn't forget, but that chose to speak instead of scream, that chose truth over retaliation, that chose clarity over collapse. And what do we do with that? That's the real question, because watching isn't enough, sharing isn't enough. We have to live differently, speak differently, vote differently, teach our children differently. We have to tell the truth, especially when it hurts, especially when it indicts us, especially when it dismantles the stories we grew up thinking were safe. Jasmine didn't end the debate, she started a reckoning, and now the weight of that reckoning doesn't sit on her shoulders anymore, it sits on ours. It's not enough to admire courage. At some point you have to decide what kind of story you're willing to stand inside and what you're willing to risk to change it. If Jasmine taught us anything, it's this: silence is Never neutral, it's not a shield, it's not an escape, it's a choice, and it always favors the system that needs no defense. The room she stood in wasn't designed for voices like hers, it was built to absorb them, to dull their edges, to trap them in decorum and drown them in delay. But she refused, and that refusal, it cracked something open, not just in Congress, not just on social media, but in us, in every viewer who saw themselves in her stillness, in every listener who heard the unspoken question behind her words. If I can carry this truth into the fire, why won't you speak it in the safety of your home, your job, your school? So now the question isn't what will Jasmine do next, it's what will we do? Because injustice doesn't end in hearings, it ends in classrooms, in courtrooms, in living rooms. It ends when someone reads a racist policy and doesn't look away, when someone hears a cruel joke and doesn't laugh it off, when someone gets up even if their voice shakes and says, "That's not who we are. That's not who we're going to be." That is how change begins, not with perfection, but with pressure applied again and again and again, until the walls start to move. You don't have to run for office to dismantle injustice, but you do have to show up in your city council meetings, in your child's curriculum, in the places where laws are made, enforced, or manipulated. Demand that prosecutors face transparency, demand that judges reflect the people they serve, demand that sentencing data isn't hidden behind bureaucracy but laid bare like Jasmine. Did you saw how one folder silenced a room of lawmakers? Imagine what a nation armed with truth can do when it refuses to flinch. And if you've never faced injustice yourself, then your responsibility is twice as large, because privilege isn't a guilt trip, it's a tool. And tools left unused rust into complicity. You don't need to be Jasmine, but you can stand with her. You can speak when it's uncomfortable, vote when it's inconvenient, listen when it's painful, learn when it's easier not to, and act even when you're afraid, especially then. Because history won't remember who kept quiet, it will remember who stood up. And if you're still asking, what can I do? The answer is simple: start where you are, with what you have in your voice, your vote, your values. Because in a world that told Jasmine to sit down, she stood. In a country that asked her to leave, she answered with lineage and truth. And in a moment where most would have stayed silent, she spoke. Now it's your turn. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together our voices make a